She'ela. So this she'ela is be'inyan kfiya ba'arama al tzedakah, using deceptive practices to collect tzedakah. Okay, so the first she'ela is isha shebala kamtzan ve'eno noten klal litzedakah. A woman's husband is miserly and does not give anything to tzedakah. Is it permitted for her to distribute his money to tzedakah without his knowledge? In other words, she would take a fair amount, the amount that a person of his income would normally distribute according to what's recommended in the halacha svarim. And is it permitted for her to do that? So tshuva, techila nakdim b'simen zeh bi'ur hashitot be'inyan kfiya al tzedakah. So first of all, we have to explain what is a person's obligation as far as when can a community coerce a person to give tzedakah? When we say coerce, meaning basically assess a person and say, if you want to be part of our community, you have to give this such and such amount. So, and in the course of describing this, going through the different opinions, we'll be able to better answer the original question. So if a person in general does not want to give tzedakah, or he doesn't want to give according to his ability, he wants to just give a minimal amount, when in reality he's capable, or really he should be giving more based on his income. L'gabei adam kazeh, yesh mi sha'omer, shirak beistin shel gimel yachol lachufo al tzedakah. So there's one opinion that says that only a beistin of 3 rabbanim can actually place an order upon a person to give tzedakah. There's another opinion that states that an individual in the community can assess him without going through a formal beis din. But you have to be careful not to assess him more than what he would be obligated to give based on the laws of tzedakah, because you're not allowed to assess a person more than his basic obligation. And we learned that the basic obligation can be a minimal amount per year. So we have to really see what's going on, unless the person is part of a community which has a tax assessment on all of its community members. We've learned, I don't know, this has been a long time ago, but we learned in Yoredei in another siman that a community can assess a person who avails himself of the community resources. Let's say if a person comes to a shul and the shul has a membership fee, the shul can assess the person a membership fee and basically obligate the person to pay. So before we go any further, just scanning the sources on the bottom, and so we're not going to get into all of the sources right now. Yeah.
Family investigating tzedakah. Is there a family tzedakah mitzvah, or is it just that one person in the family?
It's the person whose name is on the bank account. Yeah. Or actually, it's even more than that. Her name could be on the bank account, but she's not the money doesn't really technically belong to her because she didn't earn it. Let's say he earned it and she didn't earn it. legally she owns half. The question is that considered her income or not? I'm just looking at all of these biurim, and the fact of the matter is that all the rest of this discussion is just based on the analysis that he has on the bottom. So just debating with myself whether we should look into the biurim, because we've basically finished the first shaila. The first shaila is, who can coerce a person to give tzedakah? And the answer is that it's a machlokas whether you need a beis din or whether you need a community representative who's just acting as an individual. But everyone agrees that you cannot assess an individual more than the halacha would obligate him. So maybe we'll start the biurim here and we'll see how far we get. He says, Hinei b'tosvos hikshu madua kofim al mitzvahs aseh shel tzedakah lamrot shematan schar b'tzida v'kasvu kama terutzim. Tosfos asks the question, on what basis can we coerce a person to fulfill a positive commandment of tzedakah? After all, the Torah tells you the reward, and let a person just decide for himself whether he wants to receive the reward or not. Uvebeis Yosef uveshach, and Tosfos provide multiple answers. Uvebeis Yosef uveshach nira denaktu lahalacha keteretz shekofim mishum shebitzdaka benosef laaseh yesh lavin. So, in citing this Tosfos, it seems that the predominant answer that the poskim go with is the answer where Tosfos says that in addition to there being a positive commandment of tzedakah, there are also negative commandments that are associated with the positive commandment of tzedakah. So, like for example, lo sa'ametz es yadecha, right? Lo, right? What's the language of the pasuk? Do not have a hard heart when a poor person comes to you for charity. V'lo sikpotz es yadecha le'achicha havion, and do not withdraw your hand from your brother who is the poor man. The Torah gives us negative commandments that are associated with the positive commandment of tzedakah. Umashma shahakfiyah hi al ha'aseh v'rak mishum dikva ze gam lavin lachein lo amrinan davi mitzvahs aseh shematan schar b'tzida v'imkein hakfiyah al tzedakah doma l'kfiyah al shar mitzvahs aseh. He says, because there are negative commandments associated with it, that's the reason why we coerce a person to fulfill this mitzvah. In other words, normally, if a guy decides he doesn't want to build the sukkah, we can't coerce him to build the sukkah. If a guy decides he's not going to buy himself a lulav and an esrog, we can't coerce him to do that. But when it comes to tzedakah, the reason why it seems that the poskim hold that you can coerce a person to give tzedakah is because there are negative commandments that are associated with it. And I don't know whether this is part of the calculus, but it's a communal it's part of the social contract that you become part of when you're part of a community, that everyone is going to contribute their fair share and join together with the rest of the community to help the poor within the society. Then he says, "Uviktzos hachoshen mashve gamkein kviya al tzedakah lekviya al shar mitzvahs aseh le'inyan debishnehem bo'inyan beis din shel gimel b'zel l'shana." The Ktzos HaChoshen says that in order to coerce a person to fulfill a positive commandment, you need a beis din. He says, "V'chein mi sharoach chaver olove shatnez yochel leposhto me'alav afilu bashuk." He says, if you see a person doing a negative commandment, you're deputized to take action independently. Like if you see a guy walking down the street wearing shatnez, you can just jump him and rip off his garment, according to the halacha, right? You see a guy eating a piece of bacon in public, you can grab the bacon from his mouth and throw it to the ground and stomp on it, right? That's what the halacha tells you to do. We don't do that as a matter of course today. Don't try this at home, as they say, right? Because if you do, you'll probably get arrested, right? But in other words, the idea being is that there's a difference between when you see someone violating a negative commandment versus not fulfilling a positive commandment. When a person's not fulfilling a negative commandment, or he's violating, I should say, a negative commandment, like wearing shatnez, you can take action as a lone individual. But to coerce a person to fulfill a positive commandment, like building a sukkah or giving tzedakah, there you need a full-fledged beis din to convene and to submit a formal order to the individual as a beis din. So that's the opinion of the Ketzos. Yeah.
Higher level of enforcement?
Yeah, you would think so, but I don't think it's based on the level of punishment. It could be, but right when it comes to Shabbos observance, if look at the end of the day, we don't enforce in the modern world. We don't act as enforcers of people's non-compliance with religious observance. But the purpose of this shaila is that if there's basis for coercing a person to give tzedakah, then perhaps we could justify a wife or some other family member who, against the person's will, takes their money and distributes it to tzedakah, or without their knowledge. That's the only real ramification of this halacha. None of the other things that we're seeing now are halacha lamaisa, because whether it's a mitzvah aseh or a mitzvah lo aseh, there's no such thing as coercing a person in the modern world. Ulam b'meiri mashma shahakafiyah hi al ha'isr v'zel l'shona. He says, but the Meiri seems to say that the reason why we can coerce for tzedakah is because there's a negative commandment associated with it. He says, Zesha bi'arnu shekofen al tzedakah yeshol inba b'ma shamru b'maseches chulim b'per kol habasar kol mitzvah shematan schar b'tzida ein beis din muzharin aleha. He says that anytime, he says, by what right do we have to coerce a person to fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah? The Torah, after all, provides the reward for tzedakah, and there's a general principle of any time the Torah tells us the reward, you'll get long life, and you'll become, God will bless you. L'man yivarechecha Hashem Elokecha, that God will bless you b'chol ma'asecha, in all of your acts. Then the beis din can't coerce for such a mitzvah. The Torah says God will bless you. So if you give tzedakah. So on what right do we ever have to coerce a person to give tzedakah? V'yesh meforshim kofen legamrei bahaka o b'yerida l'nechasav v'lo amru kol mitzvah shematan schara in beis din muzharin aleha ela b'mitzvahs aseh. Aval zu mitzvahs lo saseh hu d'chsiv lo sikpotzes yadecha v'lo sa'amet ses levavcha ad kan l'sham. So the Meiri says that because there's a negative commandment associated with this, that you may not be miserly, you may not harden your heart. So there's a negative commandment. That's the reason why we're allowed to go full force and even use corporal punishment or deprive a person of his livelihood. In other words, let's say boycott his business in the community if he doesn't do this mitzvah. Right, so communities, I guess, what's available to them, I guess in the modern world, what would be available to an individual would be, let's say, a person is not complying with the community standards of tzedakah, or is not complying with the community standards in any way, and people are upset with this person because they see he's openly mechalel Shabbos, but he comes to shul. So the community would have, I guess under the guidance of the rabbi, would have an option to boycott this person's business if he relies on the Jewish community for his livelihood, right? Which again is a very, very narrow margin of situations. I don't think it would apply to a community like ours in almost any instance, but I could certainly understand, like if you were living in a much more insulated community where a person, let's say, owns a butcher shop and people see him going to a place where from Jews should not be going, and it's reported that he's doing unsavory things, so they could boycott this person based upon the fact that he's not living a life that he should be, right? So,
Rabbi,
hold on, Doug is asking a question, then we'll get to you, Shmuel.
thank you.
That's the argument that's being put forward here. You mean any mitzvah of the Torah?
If you follow my commandments, this is what I'll do. If you don't follow my commandments, this is
Right, generically, right.
So how come, why isn't that extrapolated?
Right.
How
That's a fair question. Doug is asking, there's a general catch-all where the Torah gives a if you do and if you don't, then that should sort of cover every mitzvah to make it both a mitzvah saseh and a mitzvah lo saseh. Yeah, that's true, but the fact is that halacha does distinguish between mitzvah lo saseh and mitzvah saseh. Even the penalties for the violation of the mitzvah saseh is much less than a violation of the mitzvah lo saseh. So, for example, if a person eats pork, the penalty is lashes. If a person fails to put up a sukkah, there is no penalty that the Beis Din can administer for that, because the Torah does not say that there is a penalty for that offense. So there are gradations based on whether it's a positive or a negative. Okay, so the failure to fulfill a positive commandment is not as great of an offense than proactively violating the Torah by violating a thou shalt not. So, just to conclude this paragraph, he says, "Umimasha kasav avalzu mitzvahs lo sasehi nirasha kafiyahi al ha'isr." So the Meiri's language tends to imply that the whole basis for coercing a person to fulfill tzedakah is because it's associated with a negative commandment in addition to the positive. And using that argument, it would be permitted for even a private individual to coerce a person to give tzedakah, just like as a private individual, I can enforce the mitzvah of shatnez by ripping off a person's garment in public. Okay, so that's the argument as to why it would be permitted to coerce a person to give tzedakah, even as a private individual. A private individual should be allowed to do that, if you're understanding that the reason why we can coerce is because of the fact that it's associated with a lo saseh, a negative command. Well, I think that the one part of this discussion that's being overlooked is that there are certain mitzvahs that are of a social nature. No, there's an inherent difference between the mitzvah of building a sukkah and the mitzvah of giving tzedakah. The mitzvah of building a sukkah is not part of any social contract. The mitzvah of tzedakah is part of a social contract. The only way that the community can function properly is if its members give tzedakah. If nobody gives tzedakah, we'll have poor people dying in the street, and our religious institutions will not be able to succeed. So that's, I don't know why the author at this point has not made that distinction, but if I were to sort of write my own commentary here, that's what I would be focusing on. And I would therefore say that the reason for what you call tznius police, or creating a community standard for modest dress, is that that's actually codified in halacha, that every community has the right to create its own social order as far as tznius is concerned, as far as how women dress. So for example, if an entire community places it's the standard that women have to wear stockings, even though that's not required by halacha to wear stockings, but there is something called das Yehudis, which means that it's a community standard of the Jewish community. And whatever that communal standard is, the individuals who are living within that community have to abide by it. So let's say you were to pick up one day and decide, you know what, I want to move to Kiryas Yoel in New York. I want to live among the Satmar Hasidim in upstate New York, and I'd like to live and be part of that community. Maybe I have a business that I want to run, which living in that community will keep me closer. So that would obligate you and your wife to live according to the community standards of Kiryas Yoel, which means that if they say you can't have a television, right, you'd have to abide by that community standard. You have communities like that in Israel today as well, where in order to be accepted within a communal order, let's say send your kids to a certain school, pray in a certain synagogue, you have to abide by certain community standards. Shmuel, what were you going to say?
Rabbi, I was going to ask a little bit different than Stockton, but Aguna, you hear of communities where they'll send out a goon squad after the husband who doesn't want to give a get. Is it because of the social community aspect that it becomes a lotase? Or is there a specific lotase relating to not giving a get to your wife?
I think that there are probably multiple mitzvahs lo saseh that we could identify for a person who's ma'again his wife, makes his wife into an aguna. There's certainly ona'ah, is causing someone affliction. The general mitzvah of ona'ah, lo sonu isha samiso, that no man may oppress his fellow by making them feel confined or oppressed. It's a general a negative commandment to lord over another person and make them, leave them with feelings of oppression, and so that certainly would be what a person who doesn't give his wife a get is doing, and that's but it's, I think it's on that basis, even though it's a mitzvah's aseh to give your wife a get, but you could argue, using this type of calculus that the author here is dealing with, that's the issue also of kofin, of coercing a person to do a mitzvah. But the Gemara does say kofin oso ad shalom erotzani, that you coerce a person until he says, I want to do the mitzvah, because there the mitzvah must be done volitionally. There's an added level of complexity in giving a woman a get, is that a get cannot be coerced, which we haven't discussed in this context over here, because there doesn't seem to be any limitation about the mitzvah of tzedakah that it has to be given out of a person's free will, otherwise it's not considered tzedakah. But I wonder if that's really true. I wonder if you can call something an act of charity if a person is forced to do it, right? Don't know. Okay, so these are all complex ideas.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, sure. I remember when Bill Clinton was running for president, and he was going on the late night show circuit. It's going back many years. The media was making fun of him because he was basically saying, when it came to paying taxes, that we're going to ask every American to make a contribution. And so the joke was, a contribution by definition is voluntary. Raising taxes is not a voluntary act. You don't say I'm contributing to my government's tax base, right? Okay. Uvechavos das kosav gamkein shakfi al hadstaka hi al ha'isur shaba kedei la'afrushe me'isura v'lo kitzos hachoshen b'zelashana. The Chavos Das is more in accord with the Meiri, and not like the Kitzos HaChoshen, who had said that it's based on the mitzvah's aseh, right? But the Chavastas also says that you're allowed to coerce him because of the negative aspect. And he writes as follows: "Va'afta b'tzedakah shu gam kein mitzvahs aseh, v'vor lekamen siman reish mem chesif alaf the Yordan l'nechasav b'tzedakah." And yet, it says in the Shulchan Aruch that you're allowed to invade a person's assets or cause a person to lose money in order to coerce him to give tzedakah. Efshar shu mitam shekasvu hatos v'sheyesh lavan b'tzedakah lo sa'ametz v'lo sikbos. It's because of the negative commandments that are associated with tzedakah. And mishum hachi ha-beistin motzian kidei lahafrisho misor, and therefore the beistin can actually invade his assets in order to prevent him from doing something prohibited. And here too, it would seem that one person would be allowed to do it, just like one person can enforce the mitzvah of shadmitz. Mishpat, and he quotes the Nesivos. Okay. Now, so I'm skipping that next paragraph. He says, "Ulam shekishabayim lachuf b'derech klal omed lefanenu safek kama oso asher roi lo lases." But how do you assess someone for giving tzedakah? How do you know how much this particular individual should give? He says, "Va'ayin b'miri shekasav lagabe gevias tamchoy v'zelashona." He says the Meiri writes, as far as coercing every member of the community to contribute to the community fund to feed the poor, he writes, "V'chol shehu tzarech umden of shikol hadas ukedine mamanis tzrichen bala beistin nota leilech ba achar haro v'atamchoy af b'gviyasot tzarech bola umdena u'leshikol hadas ad kam l'shana." So the Meiri writes that anything that requires an assessment of a person based on estimating how much that person can afford to give, there you need a beistin. So the argument that the Meiri is writing is that you need a beistin when you coerce a person to give tzedakah for another reason. Putting aside the argument of whether it's positive commandment, negative commandment, he says anything that requires some level of expertise to know how much a person should do or should give, you need a panel of judges to really assess that professionally, so that you don't over-assess and you don't under-assess. So he says, so that's the reason for requiring a beistin, irrespective of whether it's a positive or negative commandment. According to that argument, the only time an individual would have the right to coerce a person to give tzedakah is if it's clear as day that this person can afford at a minimum that amount. But if that's not so clear and it really needs proper deliberation and an assessment, then no individual would have a right to do that. And we'll hold it here for today. Yeah, well, a wife might fit that bill. Have a good